Tom Mitchell stood at the edge of his property line, watching bulldozers tear through the oak trees his grandfather had planted 70 years ago. The ancient giants fell one by one, their massive trunks hitting the earth with thunderous crashes that seemed to shake the very foundations of his family legacy. Behind him, the old farmhouse where 3 generations of Mitchells had lived and died creaked in the morning wind, as if mourning the destruction unfolding before them. The riverside. The state's Homeowners Association had moved fast. Too fast for man who still believed in handshake deals and property rights that meant something. Tom had inherited the 150 acres from his father just 2 years ago, along with debts that mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. The medical bills from his father's long battle with cancer had drained the family savings, leaving Tom with little choice but to sell parcels of land to developers who promised to preserve the natural beauty of the valley that had been the first lie. Margaret Stone, the president of the newly formed HOA, had assured Tom that only 12 homes would be built on the eastern section of his property. Luxury homes, she called them, designed to blend with the natural landscape and respect the agricultural heritage of the area. The contracts had been complex, filled with legal terminology that made Tom's head spin, but the money had been real enough. $50,000 up front with promises of more to come once the development was complete. Tom had signed the papers in good faith, believing that he could trust people who spoke of preserving the land while building their dream homes. He had been wrong about many things in his 53 years of life, but never had he been so catastrophically wrong about the nature of human greed. The HOA built 35 homes, not the modest 12-home development they had promised, but a sprawling subdivision that stretched across nearly 40 acres of his property. Homes that violated every agreement they had made. Homes that blocked ancient migration paths and destroyed wetlands that had existed since before the first settlers arrived in the valley. When Tom had confronted Margaret Stone about the breach of contract, she had simply smiled and handed him a folder full of legal documents that apparently gave the HOA the right to expand their development as they saw fit. The folder contained purchase agreements for land Tom had never agreed to sell. His signature appeared on documents he had never seen forged with a precision that spoke of professional criminality. The HOA had somehow acquired legal title to nearly half of his property through a maze of paperwork that his small-town lawyer could not begin to unravel. Fighting it in court would cost more money than Tom possessed and take years he did not have. Standing in the morning light watching another oak tree fall, Tom felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. It was not anger exactly, though anger was certainly part of it. It was the realization that sometimes in this world there existed people who took what they wanted regardless of the consequences, and sometimes those people won simply because they had more resources and fewer scruples than their victims. But Tom Mitchell was not just any victim. He was the 4th-generation owner of land that held secrets that HOA could never have imagined. His great-grandfather had been an engineer for the county water authority, back when such positions required more common sense than bureaucracy. In 1923, Thomas Mitchell Sr. had personally supervised the construction of a small earthen dam that regulated water flow through Miller Creek, the waterway that meandered through the valley and eventually joined the Missouri River 15 miles downstream. The dam had been built during the era when private landowners were encouraged to manage water resources on their property as long as they followed basic safety protocols. It was a different time when individual responsibility meant something and government oversight was minimal. The dam served multiple purposes: controlling seasonal flooding, providing irrigation water for crops, and creating a small recreational lake that had been a source of joy for 3 generations of Mitchell children. Over the decades, the dam had become so integrated into the natural landscape that most people forgot it was artificial. Cattails and willows had grown along its banks, creating habitat for waterfowl and small mammals. The lake behind it had become a minor ecosystem supporting bass and bluegill that Tom had fished since childhood. Even the county authorities seemed to have forgotten about the old dam as newer flood control projects took precedence and the original paperwork disappeared into its bureaucratic archives. But Tom remembered. He remembered his grandfather teaching him about water, flow, and pressure. He remembered learning how the spillway worked and why the earthen structure had been built with a specific slope and composition. He He remembered being 12 years old and helping his father repair damage from a particularly harsh winter when ice had shifted some of the stones in the dam face. Most importantly, Tom remembered the release mechanism, hidden behind a screen of elderberry bushes on the north side of the dam was a concrete structure that housed the original release valve. The valve was massive, constructed of cast iron and steel that had survived 7 decades of weather and neglect. It had been designed to allow controlled release of water for irrigation or emergency drainage of the lake. Tom had tested it twice. In his adult life, once during the drought of 1988, and again in 2003 when excessive rainfall had brought the lake to dangerously high levels, the valve still worked. As Tom stood watching the destruction of his family land, he began to understand that sometimes justice required a more direct approach than lawyers and courtrooms could provide. The HOA had stolen his property through legal manipulation and forgery. They had lied about their intentions and destroyed irreplaceable natural resources in pursuit of profit. They had counted on his powerlessness, on his inability to fight back against their superior resources and legal maneuvering. They had made one crucial error in their calculations. They had built their stolen subdivision in the floodplain of Miller Creek. The creek in its natural state was a lazy waterway that rarely rose above its banks except during the most extreme weather events. The dam had regulated its flow for so long that even longtime residents had forgotten how much water it actually controlled. Behind the earthen barrier lay nearly 40 million gallons of water held back by engineering that predated most environmental impact studies and floodplain mapping. Tom walked slowly back toward his farmhouse, his mind working through calculations and consequences. The HOA homes were built on low ground, barely 8 feet above the normal creek level. Their basements extended below that elevation, creating perfect collection points for any significant rise in water levels. The developers had been so confident in their legal theft that they had not bothered to conduct proper surveys or consider the historical flood patterns of the area. Inside the farmhouse, Tom pulled out maps and documents that his father had saved. From the original dam construction, the engineering surveys showed water flow rates and elevation, changes that painted a clear picture of what would happen if the dam ever failed catastrophically. The creek would return to its original configuration, carving a new channel through the softest soil and lowest elevations as it sought the path of least resistance to the Missouri River. That path led directly through the center of Riverside Estates. Tom spent the rest of the morning reading through the technical specifications of the dam structure. The release valve could be opened gradually to drain the lake over several days, or it could be opened completely to release all 40 million gallons. In a matter of hours, the controlled release option would cause minor flooding downstream, but nothing that would threaten human life. The complete release would be another matter entirely. But Tom was not interested in causing harm to people. He was interested in justice. The HOA residents had moved into their stolen homes with the assumption that their legal theft would go unchallenged. They had decorated their stolen property and planted gardens on soil that belonged to someone else. They had formed committees and established rules for a community built on fraud and deception. They believed themselves safe behind their legal barriers and superior resources. Tom intended to teach them about the impermanence of all human endeavors. That afternoon, he drove into town to visit Frank Morrison, the only lawyer in Miller County, who had been practicing long enough to remember when land ownership actually meant something. Frank was 78 years old and had been threatening to retire for the past decade, but he still maintained a small practice above the hardware store, where he handled wills and property transfers for clients who preferred handshake ethics. To corporate law, Frank listened carefully as Tom explained the situation with the HOA and the forged property transfers. The old lawyer examined the documents with the thoroughness of someone who had spent 6 decades untangling legal messes created by greed and stupidity. When he finished reading, Frank set the papers aside and removed his glasses to clean them. "Slowly you have been robbed," Frank said. "Simply there is no other word for what has happened here. These documents are sophisticated forgeries, and this HOA has committed multiple felonies in acquiring your property. The problem is proving it in court, and that will take time and money you do not possess. Nodded. He had expected as much. What are my options? Frank replaced his glasses and leaned back in his chair. Legally, your options are limited. The HOA has deep pockets and experienced attorneys. They will drag this through the courts for years while they continue to profit from your stolen land. By the time you achieve any kind of justice, they will have extracted maximum value from the development, and you will have spent yourself into bankruptcy fighting the man. Unofficially, Tom asked Frank, studied him carefully. Tom, your great-grandfather was a smart man. He understood that sometimes the law and justice are not the same thing. He also understood that the land has its own ways of solving problems when human institutions failed him. Waited for the lawyer to continue that. Damn your family. Built has been regulating Miller Creek for 7 decades, Frank said. Most people have forgotten that the creek used to flood every spring before the dam was constructed. The new development sits right in the historical floodplain on land that nature intended to be underwater. Periodically, Tom felt his pulse quicken. Are you suggesting something specific? Frank the lawyer smiled. I am suggesting that you are the legal owner of that dam, and the water it controls you have every right to manage. That water resource as you see fit within the bounds of safety and environmental responsibility. Of course, any significant changes to water flow patterns should be preceded by appropriate warnings to downstream residents. Tom understood the lawyer was giving him a roadmap to legal revenge that evening. Tom walked the perimeter of the dam, examining the structure his great-grandfather had built with such care and foresight. The earthen barrier was still solid after all these decades, but Tom could see places where age and weather had taken their toll. Small trees had grown from the dam face, their roots potentially compromising the integrity of the structure. Animal burrows had created weak points that could become problems if not addressed properly. The dam needed maintenance, Tom realized, and proper maintenance might require draining the lake to allow for repairs. Spent the next 3 days researching water law and dam safety regulations. The legal framework was complex, but the basic principle was clear. Property owners had both rights and responsibilities regarding water resources on their land. They could manage those resources as needed, but they were also obligated to prevent their property from causing harm to others. Tom was careful to document everything he photographed, potential weak points in the dam structure. He researched historical flood patterns and water flow rates. He studied weather forecasts and seasonal rainfall predictions. He wanted to ensure that when he took action, it would be both legal and defensibly. Thursday morning, Tom drove to the county courthouse to file the necessary paperwork. Officially, he was requesting permits for dam maintenance and temporary water release. The forms required detailed explanations of the proposed work and its potential impact on downstream properties. Tom was thorough in his descriptions, noting that the maintenance work might require significant reduction in lake levels and that downstream residents should be prepared for increased water flow in Miller Creek. The county clerk accepted the paperwork without question. Dam maintenance was a routine matter, and Tom had included all the required technical information. The permits would be processed within 5 business days and posted at the courthouse for public review. Once approved, Tom would have legal authorization to proceed with his maintenance project. That same afternoon, Margaret Stone called him Mr. Mitchell, she said in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. I understand you have filed some sort of permit application that could affect water levels in the creek. I want to discuss this matter with you immediately. Tom had been expecting this call. The HOA president was nothing if not thorough in monitoring anything that might affect her stolen subdivision. What would you like to discuss? I want to understand exactly what kind of maintenance you are planning and how it might impact our community, Margaret said. Our development represents a significant investment, and we cannot allow irresponsible water management to threaten our property values. Community, Tom said carefully, is built on land that you fraudulently acquired through forged documents. I have no obligation to consider your concerns when managing water resources on my own property. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Margaret spoke again, her voice had lost its authoritative tone. Mr. Mitchell, I think there may be some misunderstandings about the property acquisition. We acted in good faith based on documents provided by your representatives. I never had any representatives. Tom said, and you know it, you forged my signature on documents I never saw and stole property that my family has owned for 4 generations now. You want to discuss water management? As if we are neighbors with mutual interests, Margaret cleared her throat. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss this situation. I am sure we can reach some sort of understanding that works for everyone involved. Considered this, Margaret Stone was clearly worried about something, and her sudden willingness to negotiate suggested that the HOA legal position might not be as strong as they had pretended. What did you have in mind we could offer to purchase additional land from you at fair market value? Margaret said. Or perhaps we could work out some sort of partnership arrangement that would benefit both parties. Tom almost laughed. The woman who had stolen his land was now offering to buy more of it. I will consider your proposal, he said, but I want to see the original documents that granted your HOA title to my property, not copies, but the original. Paperwork with chain of custody documentation that might be difficult, Margaret said. I imagine it would be, Tom replied, since those documents do not exist. You have 3 days to produce them, or I proceed with my dam maintenance project. After ending the call, Tom felt a grim satisfaction. The HOA president was scrambling, which meant his strategy was working. The threat of water problems had gotten her attention in a way that legal challenges never could. People like Margaret Stone understood money and power, but they also understood natural forces that could not be bribed or intimidated. Over the weekend, Tom made his final preparations, checked and rechecked the release valve mechanism, ensuring that it would operate smoothly. When the time came, he reviewed his documentation one more time, making sure that every aspect of his plan was legally defensible. He even called Frank Morrison to discuss the finer points of water law and property rights. On Monday morning, the county approved his permits. The official authorization was posted at the courthouse, and copies were mailed to all downstream property owners, including the residents of Riverside Estates. The permits granted Tom the right to release up to 20 million gallons of water from his lake over a period of 48 hours for the purpose of dam maintenance and repair. 20 million gallons was exactly half of the lake's capacity. Tom had calculated that this amount would be sufficient to flood the HOA subdivision without creating dangerous conditions further downstream. The water would be spread across several square miles by the time it reached inhabited areas beyond the development, so the impact would be minimal for innocent parties. Tuesday morning brought an urgent call from Margaret Stone. Mr. Mitchell, this water release cannot proceed, she said. Her voice carried a note of panic that Tom found deeply satisfying. Our homes will be flooded. You cannot do this. I can and I will, Tom replied. My permits are in order, and the work is necessary for public safety. The dam has several structural issues that need to be addressed, and that requires draining the lake. This is revenge, she accused. We're doing this because of the property dispute. Felt no need to deny the obvious. This is dam maintenance, he said. If your homes are built in a floodplain, that is a problem. Should have considered before you built them illegally on stolen land. Margaret was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her tone had changed from panic to calculation. What would it take to delay this project, she asked. We might be able to work out a settlement regarding the property issues. Tom had been hoping for this opening. Now we are having an honest conversation, he said. I want my property back, all of it. I want the HOA to remove every structure built on land you fraudulently acquired. I want full compensation for the environmental damage you have caused, and I want a public admission that you obtained the property through illegal means. That is impossible, Margaret said. We have invested millions of dollars in this development. Our residents have bought homes in good faith. Cannot simply abandon everything. Then I suggest you should have thought about that before you decided to steal my land, Tom said. You have until 6 a.m. tomorrow morning to begin removing structures from my property. If you do not, I will begin the water release at sunrise. The call ended with Margaret Stone making threats about lawsuits and criminal charges. Tom was not concerned. The county had approved his permits, and he had documented every aspect of the dam maintenance project. His actions were not only legal, but necessary for public safety given the structural issues he had identified that evening. Tom walked down to the dam one final time before implementing his plan. The lake stretched out before him, reflecting the colors of the sunset in its still waters. For 70 years, this body of water had served his family, providing irrigation, recreation, and a sense of peace in an increasingly chaotic world. Tomorrow it would serve a different purpose. Tom thought about his great-grandfather and the foresight that had led to the construction of this dam. Thomas Mitchell Sr. had understood that water was power in its most fundamental form. He had built the dam not just to control flooding, but to give his descendants options. In a world where those with money and influence often trampled on the rights of common people, now that power would be unleashed in service of justice. Dome examined the release valve one more time, the massive iron mechanism was designed to withstand enormous pressure and would open smoothly once he began turning the wheel. Tomorrow morning he would rotate that wheel exactly 18 complete turns, which his calculations indicated would drain 20 million gallons in approximately 6 hours. The water would follow the path of least resistance down Miller Creek and into the low-lying areas where the HOA had built their stolen subdivision. The homes had basements that extended below the normal creek level, creating perfect collection points for the floodwaters. The HOA had inadvertently designed their development to be as vulnerable as possible to exactly the kind of flooding Tom was about to create. Tom walked back to the farmhouse feeling the weight of history and responsibility on his shoulders. He was about to take an action that could not be undone. An action that would affect dozens of people and alter the landscape of the valley forever. But sometimes in life, there came moments when a person had to choose between accepting injustice and fighting back with whatever tools were available. The HOA had chosen to use fraud and legal manipulation as their weapons. Tom had chosen water. He slept soundly that night for the first time in months. At 5:30 the next morning, Tom dressed in his work clothes and walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the dam. The air was still and cold, with mist rising from the lake's surface, like the ghosts of all the fish he had caught in these waters over the decades. He carried a thermos of coffee and a folding chair because he intended to witness every moment of what was about to unfold. The release valve was exactly where it had been for 70 years, hidden behind elderberry bushes and protected by a concrete housing that had weathered decades of storms and seasons. Tom cleared away the vegetation that had grown around the valve mechanism and checked the wheel one final time. The metal was solid and the threading was clean. Oil that his father had applied years ago still protected the moving parts. At exactly 6 a.m., Tom began turning the wheel. First few turns required significant effort as water pressure fought against the opening mechanism, but as the valve began to open, the pressure equalized and the wheel turned more easily. Tom counted each rotation carefully. 18 complete turns, as he had calculated, would drain exactly 20 million gallons over the next 6 hours. At first, the only sign of the opening valve was a subtle change in the sound of water around the dam, a low gurgling that had not been there before. It gradually grew louder as more water began flowing through the release channel. Tom set up his chair on high ground where he could observe both the dam and the distant subdivision and settled in to watch justice unfold. Initial water release was modest. Miller Creek began to run higher and faster, but not dramatically so. A casual observer might have noticed that the creek looked different, but would not immediately recognize the significance of the change. Tom knew that it would take approximately 2 hours for the increased water flow to travel the 3 miles from his dam to the team subdivision. By 7 a.m., the lake level had dropped by 6 inches, and the release flow had stabilized. Tom could see across the valley to where the first residents of Riverside Estates were beginning their morning routines. Lights were coming on in kitchen windows, and cars were backing out of driveways as people headed to work. Completely unaware of what was heading there, Waden poured himself a cup of coffee and waited. At 8:15, his phone rang. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Captain Rodriguez with the County Emergency Services. Margaret Stone called it in, and we have reports of rising water levels in Miller Creek. Can you confirm that you are conducting authorized water release from your dam?" Tom had been expecting this call. "Yes, Captain. I have county permits for dam maintenance that authorize the release of 20 million gallons over 48 hours. I am conducting necessary repairs to address structural issues that could pose a public safety risk." The captain was quiet for a moment. "Can you tell me the current rate of release and expected duration?" "I am releasing water at approximately 3,000 gallons per minute and expect the process to continue for 6 hours. Tom said all downstream property owners were notified in accordance with county regulations. Captain Rodriguez sighed. Mr. Mitchell, we are getting reports that the HOA development is beginning to experience flooding. Do you have any recommendations for the residents? I recommend that anyone living in a floodplain should move valuables to higher. Ground Tom said this is a temporary situation and water levels will return to normal by this afternoon there. Was another pause. You realize that some people are going to claim this is intentional flooding in retaliation for your property dispute. Tom watched a great blue heron take flight from the shrinking lake. Captain, I am conducting legally authorized dam maintenance to address safety issues. The location of downstream structures is not my responsibility. After ending the call, Tom returned his attention to the unfolding drama across the valley. The water had reached Riverside Estates, and the effects were becoming visible. He could see people standing in their yards pointing at the rising creek, and several residents appeared to be moving items out of their basements. The flooding was proceeding exactly as Tom had calculated. By 9 a.m., the first emergency vehicles arrived at the subdivision. Fire trucks and ambulances positioned themselves on high ground, while emergency personnel began going door to door to ensure that all residents were safe. Tom was pleased to see that the flooding was significant enough to make the HOA homes uninhabitable but not dangerous enough to threaten human life. His phone rang again. This is Margaret. Stone, and you are going to pay for this, she screamed into the phone. We are documenting everything, and you will be sued for every penny you have ever earned. Tom remained calm. Margaret, I am conducting authorized dam maintenance. If your homes are flooding, that suggests you built them in an inappropriate location. You did this deliberately, she accused. I opened a valve on my own dam to conduct necessary repairs, Tom said. If you have concerns about the flooding, I suggest you contact your insurance company. The call ended with Margaret Stone making threats that Tom knew she could not carry out. His actions were entirely legal and the county had approved his permits. The HOA could sue him, but they would have to explain in court why their homes were built in a floodplain without proper engineering studies and how they had acquired the land in the first place. By 10 a.m., the flooding had reached its peak. Miller Creek had overflowed its banks and was flowing through the streets of Riverside Estates at a depth of approximately 3 feet. The water was not deep enough to threaten the main floors of the homes, but every basement was completely flooded, and several garages were underwater. The HOA residents had evacuated to higher ground, where they stood watching their investment disappear beneath muddy creek water. Tom felt a deep satisfaction watching the scene unfold. The people who had stolen his land were now learning about the power of natural forces that could not be bought or manipulated. The homes they had built with stolen money were being reclaimed by the water that had always belonged to this valley. His phone rang constantly throughout the morning. Emergency services wanting updates on the water release insurance companies seeking information about the flooding, local news reporters asking for interviews. Tom answered the official calls professionally and ignored the media entirely. He had no interest in publicity, only in justice. By noon, the lake level had dropped by 4 feet, and the flow rate through the release valve was beginning to decrease. Tom calculated that he had released approximately 18 million gallons, which was close enough to his target. He could have released the remaining 2 million gallons, but he was satisfied with the results. The HOA subdivision was thoroughly flooded and would remain uninhabitable for weeks. Even after the water receded at 12:30, Tom began closing the valve. The process was slower than opening it, as he had to work against reduced water pressure and accumulated debris in the mechanism. But gradually the flow decreased until only a trickle emerged from the release channel. By 1 p.m., the valve was completely closed and Miller Creek began returning to its normal level. The damage to Riverside Estates was complete. Every basement was flooded with muddy creek water that would require professional cleanup before the spaces could be used again. Several homes had suffered structural damage. As water pressure shifted foundations and buckled basement walls, the community swimming pool was filled with debris and contaminated water. The tennis court was underwater and the playground equipment was partially submerged. Tom packed up his chair and thermos and walked back to his farmhouse, feeling lighter than he had in months. The weight of injustice that had pressed down on him for so long was finally lifted. He had used the tools available to him to achieve a measure of justice that no court could have provided. That afternoon, the calls began in earnest. Margaret Stone contacted him every hour, making increasingly desperate offers to settle the property dispute. Tom answered the questions patiently and thoroughly. He had nothing to hide, and everything to document his actions had been legal, necessary, and proportionate to the harm that had been done to him. The HOA had stolen his property through fraud, and he had responded by exercising his legal rights as a dam owner by. Evening, the floodwaters had receded enough for residents to return to their homes, but the damage was extensive. Every basement would need to be gutted, and rebuilt electrical systems had been compromised throughout the development. Several homes would require foundation repairs that could take months to complete. The community facilities were destroyed and would need complete reconstruction. Tom stood on his front porch watching the lights come on in the damaged subdivision. The people who had bought homes built on his stolen land were now dealing with the consequences of fraud. They may not have been aware of, but had certainly benefited from. They would file insurance claims and demand compensation, and probably some of them would receive it, but they would also learn that sometimes in this world, actions have consequences that cannot be avoided through legal maneuvering. Margaret Stone called him one final time. That evening, "What will it take?" she asked. Her voice was defeated, and Tom could hear the sound of water pumps in the background. "We need to end this before it gets worse." Tom had been waiting for this question all day. "I want my property back," he said. "All 40 acres that you fraudulently acquired, plus compensation for environmental damage. I want a public statement acknowledging that the HOA obtained the land through illegal means, and want all structures removed from my property within 90 days." A silence stretched for nearly a minute. "That will bankrupt us," Margaret finally said. "Then you should not have stolen my land." Tom replied. The next morning, Tom walked down to survey his lake. The water level was 12 feet lower than normal, exposing mudflats and debris that had accumulated over decades, but the dam structure was solid and would refill with the next spring rains. The release valve had performed exactly as designed, proving that his great-grandfather had built something that could last for generations. Frank Morrison called him around 10 a.m. "Tom, you have achieved something remarkable here," he said. "The HOA has contacted me about negotiating a settlement. They are prepared to return your property and pay damages in exchange for a commitment that you will not conduct any more dam maintenance projects." Tom smiled. The lawyer was clearly enjoying the situation. "What kind of damages are they offering?" "They are prepared to pay for environmental restoration and provide compensation for your legal costs," Frank said. "They will also acknowledge that errors were made in the property acquisition process." "It's not errors, Tom," said. "Crimes. They committed fraud and forgery and theft. I want them to admit it publicly," Frank chuckled. "That might be difficult. They are concerned about criminal liability. If they make such admissions, then they can remain concerned." Tom said. "While they remove their houses from my property, I am in no hurry to settle over the following weeks." The true extent of the damage became clear. Insurance companies balked at covering flood damage caused by authorized dam maintenance. Environmental inspectors found numerous violations in the HOA construction projects that had never been properly permitted. County officials began investigating the property transfers that had given the HOA title to Tom's land. The forged documents began to unravel under professional scrutiny. Handwriting experts identified multiple signatures that could not have been made by Tom. Legal experts found inconsistencies in dates and notary stamps that suggested systematic fraud. The HOA had been so confident in their scheme that they had not bothered to create convincing. Stone was arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. 3 other HOA board members were also charged, along with 2 attorneys who had facilitated the illegal property transfers. The scandal made regional news as authorities discovered that the same group had targeted elderly landowners in 3 counties using similar methods. Tom found himself in the unusual position of being both a victim and a hero. The families who had been cheated by the HOA fraud ring reached out to thank him for exposing the criminal enterprise. Environmental groups praised his defense of the valley ecosystem. Legal experts cited his case as an example of how property owners could protect themselves against sophisticated fraud schemes, but Tom was most satisfied by the simple fact that his land was being returned to him. The court ordered the HOA to remove all structures from the fraudulently acquired property within 6 months. The residents of Riverside Estates were given the option to relocate their homes or accept buyouts. From the HOA insurance policies, most chose the buyouts as the flood damage had made relocation impractical. The subdivision that had destroyed so many ancient oak trees was dismantled. Piece by piece, Tom used part of the settlement money to restore. The damaged ecosystem wetlands that had been filled for construction were re-excavated. Native plants were reintroduced to areas that had been cleared for home sites. New oak trees were planted to replace the giants that had been destroyed, though. Tom knew he would not live to see them reach maturity. The dam was professionally inspected and certified as structurally sound. The release valve was overhauled and equipped with new monitoring equipment that would allow more precise control of water flow in the future. Tom had no intention of using it again, but he wanted future generations of his family to have the same options he had. Possessed Frank Morrison helped him establish a conservation easement on the restored property that would prevent future development while allowing traditional agricultural uses. His grandfather would have approved of the arrangement. Margaret Stone was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for mail fraud and conspiracy. The other conspirators received lesser sentences, but all were required to pay restitution to their victims. The attorneys involved lost their licenses and faced additional civil penalties. The scandal effectively ended large-scale development in the valley as investors became wary of the legal complications. Tom never regretted opening the dam valve. He had acted within his legal rights to protect his property and seek justice against people who had committed crimes against him. The flooding had caused property damage, but no physical harm to any person. The environmental consequences had actually been positive as the floodwaters had washed away contamination from the construction sites and restored natural drainage patterns. Most importantly, Tom had demonstrated that sometimes individual citizens could fight back successfully against institutional corruption. He had used the tools available to him: intelligence, patience, and an understanding of natural forces to achieve justice. When the legal system had failed him, the lake refilled over the course of the winter as rain and snowmelt gradually restored the water level behind the dam. By spring, the ecosystem had largely recovered from the temporary drainage. Fish populations had survived in deeper pools and quickly recolonized the lake as water levels returned to normal. Waterfowl returned to nest in the restored wetlands. Tom resumed his quiet life. On the family land, he tended a vegetable garden and maintained the farmhouse, and occasionally took visitors on tours of the nature preserve. He never spoke publicly about the events that had led to the destruction of Riverside Estates, but he also never denied what he had done when asked directly. Sometimes late in the evening, Tom would walk down to the dam and sit on the same folding chair he had used to watch the floodwaters recede. He would think about his great-grandfather and the foresight that had led to the construction of the dam. He would consider the nature of justice and the responsibilities that came with power. The release valve remained behind its screen of elderberry bushes, ready to serve if ever needed again. Tom hoped it would not be necessary, but he was comforted by the knowledge that some problems in this world could still be solved by people. Great's grandfather had given him more than land or water rights. The old engineer had provided him with the means to defend his family legacy against those who would steal it through legal trickery and superior resources. The dam had been built as a tool for managing water, but it had also served as a weapon for protecting what mattered most. Mitchell had learned that sometimes the most effective response to sophisticated crime was simple, direct action. Rooted in an understanding of natural law, the HOA had used complex fraud to steal his property, but Tom had used basic physics to take it back. Water always flowed downhill. Justice had found its own level in the valley. The oak trees his grandfather had planted were gone, but new ones were growing in their place. The subdivision built on stolen land had been swept away, but the land itself remained. Tom had preserved not just his family property, but the principle that some things could not be bought or stolen or corrupted by those who mistook legal manipulation for actual right. The dam stood ready to serve future generations, just as it had served Tom when he needed it most, and in the quiet evenings when he sat by the water, Tom could almost hear his great-grandfather whispering approval across the decades of time and the eternal movement of water through the valley they had both called home.